Hey guys, keep tinkering here. Want to talk a little bit about reset issues with the PT Millennium series of guns. This is mostly, I think, about 2013 and newer. PT111 G2, G2c, G2s. The 709 Slim might have been a little bit before this, but it falls under the same category. The G3, the G3c, and there's probably going to be a couple other guns in there as well. Maybe some future guns. So, what this can look like when you've got the gun out at the range, you would fire the gun, the slide would cycle automatically as you fire it around, and then you would let the trigger forward just a little bit until it hits that reset, fire again. So what you may run into is you're firing, and maybe once a round, once a can happen with different frequency. Sometimes it might be once a mag. Sometimes it might be once every other round. Sometimes it might be a couple rounds in a mag. Maybe every round that's having a problem. Where when you're firing, you let it forward, and it either doesn't click, or when you bring it back, it doesn't actually release, and you get a dead trigger. This may look like this. Nothing's happening there. So there's two things that might be causing this issue. The first thing you need to check is the trigger bar tension. This trigger bar, how it lifts up, the way it lifts up in the tension center is how it interacts with that rear sear right there. If this isn't popping back up quite freely and fast with some amount of force behind it, the reset is not going to work correctly. This whole trigger bar tension is applied from the trigger spring right there. It's a pretty tiny spring, and it's holding this bar all the way back here. So if there's any problems along the way, this trigger spring doesn't have a ton of leverage. So this could be that the trigger spring was a little weak from the factory. It could be that it was overextended when you were disassembling the gun. It could have been that it's old and worn out. It could be that there's grit in here somewhere. That's happened too, where there's extra friction from a contact point, or there's extra grit in there somewhere. Or sometimes it can be that the frame is pinching, particularly when you take apart the gun, whether to work on it or clean it or whatever. When you hammer the pins back in, sometimes it can pinch the frame. Good way to check for this is you can take a screwdriver or something. I like to take a relatively thin knife and just slide it in there. You're not looking to bend the trigger bar or put a ton of force on it or anything. You just kind of want to spread it out just a little bit. Like I said, particularly when you're hammering those pins back in, things can get pinched. So whatever the case may be, if your trigger bar isn't popping back up nice and firmly with good speed, your reset is not going to function properly, and you're going to need to get that fixed. So the next thing, and this is kind of a manufacturing tolerances issue. What can happen here is sometimes when Taurus is making these trigger bars, the end of the bar is pointed too far upward. So this, like I said, this can somewhat seem a little counterintuitive. This one is actually about perfect. Notice if I pull this trigger bar straight back, it's not actually activating the sear, but it's barely touching the bottom of it. You can kind of hear that. So what happens if this trigger, and here I'll show you, if I push, and this is common for left-handed people. Left-handed people commonly push from the left to the right on the trigger slightly. So if I push left to right, you don't hear anything. That trigger bar is twisted like this, and the projection on the end of that trigger bar, this guy right there, which shows up down there. Trigger bar is twisted like this, that projection goes downward a little bit. So it actually completely misses the sear. Like I said, this seems a little counterintuitive. Let me show you though. But once the striker tab settles into place on the sear, it pushes it down slightly, puts it in perfect position, everything works great. You notice if you push like right-handed people commonly do, from the right to the left on the trigger. Now watch. It's actually hitting that rear sear and it's activating it, because as I pushed, the trigger went more like this, and now that projection is up a little bit. So if the projection was already twisted upward a little too much, now things won't work correctly, which is what you get here. Like I said, if I pull this gun straight back, it works. If I push it over to the left, from left to right, I'm sorry, like I was a left-handed person, it works. If I'm holding it like I'm a right-handed person and I'm putting some pressure from the right to the left, see? It does all this screwy stuff. It doesn't really like reset right. If it's come over a little bit. In fact, it won't even work now until I push it like that, and now it releases. So the issue here literally is safe. Like I said, that trigger bar end, and you can actually see it on this gun. I've removed the pins. This is easier to see. So this may function fine on a stock gun for a while, or it may cause a problem, because the stock guns, as a lot of you know out there, with the stock trigger safeties, especially when they're brand new and super grabby, they often hang up, they cause issues, and if you try to put any pressure to the side, they hang up. If people are not being very conscious to pull straight back, the trigger safety hangs up. So these guns may seem to be correct from the factory when they have a super grabby trigger safety, because you could only pull them straight back. But as everything wears in, or if it was a little looser from the factory, or in the case of this where you trade out the trigger for one that doesn't have that that trigger safety that hangs up so often, and you're allowed to put pressure one way or another, it causes this issue. So this is why you may not experience it on a new gun, but if you change out the trigger, or if your gun is worn in, or you remove the trigger safety from the stock trigger, you can all of a sudden experience this issue. You can actually see this to some extent. Let me see if I can actually show this. See how this trigger bar is... It's a little hard to get it exactly right in the camera here. See how the end of it is almost straight in line with the bar? But this one actually goes upward a little bit. It's twisted like that. So you can actually take this guy. I have a pair of flat nose pliers that I use that don't have any ridges in there. And you can very carefully, and you want to just do it a little bit at a time. You can do this while the trigger's in the gun if you're careful. See, now it's a little more in line. So let's check it. So we take the rear sear assembly. Nope. It would help if I made sure that safety detent ball was in place first. I want to make sure that whole arm is sliding into the right pocket there. We take it. So you can see that it's still not perfect, although this might work. But on the other one, as I said, when I pulled it straight back, It was barely missing the sear. And that really is perfect. The further you have it down that sear, the further the further down the end of that trigger bar projection is, the more leverage you'll have against that sear. So the easier the trigger pull will be. So like I said, optimally, you want it like this, which is barely hitting the end of that sear. But let's try it. Pin's just a little bit here. Got to hold it in place. Make sure everything's there. So now, we're pulling it. We're making sure to pull it straight back. Reset is working correctly. Now if I push it from the right to the left, it's normal. It's working, but it feels like it's hesitating just a little bit. So once more. Like I said, this would probably work okay. I was putting quite a bit of pressure from the right to the left. So for a normal user, as long as you're not being crazy, it should be okay. But let's see if we can tweak it just a little bit further for optimal. So like I said, what we want to do is make sure that comes down just a little bit more. You don't want to grab it by the very end. If you notice, it's got a relatively weak connection right there. So you do want to grab it a little bit further back. And just as soon as you feel any movement on that guy, so now if you notice, it's much closer to in line with that trigger bar. So like I said, you want to be careful. It is metal. You can metal fatigue it. That is definitely a possibility. So you don't want to be bending it back and forth. You don't want to bend it way too far and then try to bend it back. Be cautious. Just try to bend it a little bit at a time. Use the minimum required force to get a little movement. Check and see where you are. Test it. So that's me pressing fairly hard from the right to the left. All of a sudden, that reset. So even the reset's not as audible when you're pushing it that way because the way the trigger bar is working, but it is functioning now, so you're not going to have that dead trigger. And do keep in mind I am putting a fair amount of force here. But it's working in all directions now. So in that case, I would say this is a perfectly usable gun. It's still touching that sear, so maybe not exactly optimal. Like I said, but it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. This gun would function just as it is. You may lose a small fraction of a pound of pull weight by getting it optimal, where it's just barely catching the bottom of that sear when the slide is not on. So hopefully that helps you guys out, particularly those with reset issues that you don't know what's going on or why you're occasionally getting a dead trigger. Please subscribe if you like what you saw. Thank you guys very much for watching and have a great day. Bye.